In the beginning, there was only the moon and the shadow. They were never meant to be apart, yet for 1,000 years our world has been defined by the blood spilled between them. The Shadow Pack, rulers of the iron and the dark, led by a line of alphas who governed with a fist of stone. And the Silvermoon Seers, the keepers of the light, driven into the whispers of history by a purge that nearly erased them from the earth. Prophecy spoke of a day when the two would meet again. It said that the union of the moon and the shadow would either save the north or burn it to the ground. But the prophecy carried a price. For one to rule in power, the other must be the sacrifice. Most thought the Silvermoon line was dead. Most thought the Alpha King was invincible. They were wrong. Chapter 1. The Storm and the Spear. The wind didn't just blow in the Blackwood Peaks, it hunted. A jagged, freezing force, it tore at my lungs and crystallized my breath into shards of ice before the air even cleared my lips. Every inhale felt like swallowing needles. I pulled my furs tighter, the heavy scent of pine and old snow thick in my senses, yet even the familiar musk of the forest couldn't settle the sudden, frantic pacing of my wolf. For 3 years, this isolation had been my sanctuary, my fortress. As a rogue, I had mastered the most brutal lesson of the wild. Silence is the only thing that keeps you alive. If they cannot hear you, they cannot hunt you. But tonight, the mountain's silence was being shredded. It began as a metallic tang in the air, the sharp, unmistakable scent of copper blood mingling with the burnt ozone of dark magic. My wolf, usually a quiet hum in the back of my mind, suddenly surged forward, her hackles rising. "Danger," she whispered, her voice a low vibration against my skull. Or destiny. I hated her penchant for the poetic. In my experience, destiny usually heralded a shallow grave. I crested the jagged ridge near the devil's throat, shielding my eyes against the blinding whiteout. That's when I saw it. A massive, dark shape slumped against a monolith of black granite, barely visible through the swirling snow. At first, I mistook it for a fallen cedar, uprooted by the gale. But as the wind shifted, it carried a scent that hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was the scent of sandalwood, rain-drenched earth, and power. Absolute, terrifying power. It was an alpha's scent, though distorted and heavy with the cloying stench of approaching death. I approached slowly, my boots crunching softly on the frozen crust of the snow. My hand hovered over the silver-tipped dagger at my belt, a rogue's best friend and a shifter's worst nightmare. As I drew closer, the air grew thick, charged with a static that made the hair on my arms stand on end. My heart nearly stopped. It wasn't a fallen tree. It was a man, or at least what remained of one. He was pinned to the rock like a butterfly in a macabre collection. A heavy obsidian-black spear had been driven through his side, anchoring his massive frame into the stone. The weapon wasn't merely stone, though. The obsidian was laced with silver filigree that hissed and sparked where it bit into his flesh. Oily tendrils of black smoke rose from the wound, a sign that the silver was actively rotting his spirit. He was a warrior, built like a titan. Even slumped and broken, his presence was staggering. His dark hair was matted with frozen blood, and his clothes, high-quality leather and fine silk, spoke of a world I had long since abandoned. This was royal attire. My breath hitched as the realization settled in. This wasn't a mere pack scuffle or a border skirmish. This was an execution. "I should leave you," I whispered, my voice thin and fragile against the roaring gale. "If I even touch a silver-laced spear, I'm as dead as you are. Perhaps more so." I turned to walk away. I forced my feet to move, taking 1, then 2, then 3 steps back into the whiteout. My survival instincts screamed at me to vanish, to let the snow bury both this secret and the man attached to it. If I stayed, the monsters who did this would surely return to finish the job. But then, a sound fractured the wind. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a low, agonizing groan that vibrated through the very ground beneath my boots. The frequency matched the beating of my own heart, creating a visceral pull that made my wolf whine in distress. Against every rule of the rogue code, I turned back. I knelt in the red-stained snow, looking at his face for the first time. Even in the grip of death, he was hauntingly handsome. A sharp, regal jawline, thick lashes, and a brow furrowed in eternal defiance. He looked like a king who had refused to die simply because the world told him it was time. "Who did this to you?" I murmured, reaching out a trembling hand. The air between us felt electric, the gap narrowing until I could feel the heat radiating from his poisoned skin. I didn't know then that by reaching for that spear, I was ending my life as Elara the Ranger. I didn't know that the man dying in the snow was Silas Vane, the Shadow Alpha, the King of the North. I only knew that the mountain took enough souls. It wasn't taking this one. Not tonight. Chapter 2. The Golden Spark. The moment my bare fingers brushed the surface of his skin to check for a pulse, the world simply ceased to exist. It wasn't a mere spark, it was an explosion. A localized supernova of golden light erupted from the point of contact, surging up my arm and slamming into my chest with the momentum of a charging bull. My vision fractured into pure white, and for a heartbeat, I was no longer standing in a blizzard. I was adrift in a sea of fire, and I was not alone. "Found you." The voice didn't originate from the air. It resonated from my very marrow. Deep, ancient, and heavy, it possessed a gravity that threatened to pull my soul right out of my body. I gasped, reeling back, but I couldn't break the contact. It was as if our skin had fused, soldered together by an invisible heat. The silver in the spear reacted violently to my presence. The black smoke curdled into a frantic, oily mist as the golden light waged war against the poison. I watched in a mixture of horror and awe as the necrotized black veins on the man's neck began to recede, retreating from the righteous glow of my touch. Then, his eyes snapped open. They weren't the eyes of a human, or even those of a common shifter. They were twin pools of burning violet, glowing with a predatory intensity that pinned me to the spot. The sheer pressure of his alpha aura hit the air like a physical shockwave, instantly stilling the wind around us into a dead, eerie calm. It was a heavy, suffocating weight, the kind of power that forced mountains to bow. His hand, which had looked so lifeless moments before, suddenly shot up and clamped around my wrist. His grip was a vice of iron and searing heat. He didn't look like a man who had been on the verge of death. He looked like a god awakened from a dark, restless sleep. "You," he rasped. His voice sounded like tectonic plates shifting, a sound that made my wolf howl in a confusing mix of terror and absolute submission. I struggled to pull away, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Let go! I'm trying to help you!" He didn't listen. With terrifying strength, he pulled me closer, dragging my body against his bloodied chest until our faces were mere inches apart. The golden light between us pulsed in rhythmic waves, synchronized with our racing heartbeats. The bond, the fated mate connection I had spent my life hiding from, was weaving itself around us in shimmering threads of fate. It was undeniable. It was terrifying. He tilted his head, inhaling deeply at the crook of my neck, his nostrils flaring as he caught my scent. A low, guttural vibration started deep in his chest, a sound that wasn't quite a growl but a primal claim. "I spent 1,000 nights hunting for this scent in my dreams," he whispered, his violet eyes locking onto mine with a possessive hunger that made my knees weak. "You think a rogue can hide from her king? You're not a ghost anymore, Elara." My name. He knew my name. He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of my ear. The word he spoke next didn't just vibrate in the air, it branded my soul, marking the end of my freedom and the beginning of my destiny. Mine. Chapter 3. Silver Poison. The trek back to my cabin was a blur of agonizing effort and surging adrenaline. I was forced to shift partially, allow my wolf's predatory strength to flood my limbs, just to drag Silas's massive frame through the deepening snowdrifts. Every time he groaned, The bond in my chest flared with a sympathetic pain so sharp it made me stumble, my own ribs aching as if the obsidian spear were buried in my side instead of his. Once inside, I collapsed onto the floor, hauling him toward the warmth of the hearth. The cabin, which usually felt spacious and cozy, now seemed claustrophobic, dominated by the overwhelming presence of the Alpha King. The scent of him, that intoxicating sandalwood and gathering storm, saturated the air, clashing with the sharp medicinal aroma of the dried herbs hanging from my rafters. "Stay with me, Silas," I hissed, my hands trembling as I stripped away his blood-soaked leather tunic. The wound was horrific. The silver hadn't merely pierced him, it was actively consuming him. Silver was a slow, agonizing death for an alpha, a poison that targeted the spirit as much as the flesh. Black, webbed tracks of infection were spreading across his ribs like a rot, pulsing with a sick, oily light that seemed to swallow the firelight. I grabbed my hunting knife and thrust the blade into the glowing heart of the fire. I didn't have the luxury of being gentle. I had to cauterize the necrotic tracks and extract the remaining silver shards from his muscle before the poison reached his heart. If it touched his core, no amount of fated mate magic could bring him back. As the blade turned a lethal, glowing orange, Silas began to thrash, his fever spiking so high that steam seemed to rise from his sweat-slicked skin. "Elara, stop," he murmured, his eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. "The shadow. It's coming for us." "Shh," I whispered, pinning his massive shoulders down with the entirety of my weight. "I've got you. I'm not letting them take you, not while I still draw breath." The moment the hot steel touched his skin, the cabin filled with the sharp hiss of steam and the acrid stench of burnt hair and agonizing silver. Silas let out a roar of such raw power that it shattered the glass in my small window, his body arching off the floor in a violent spasm. I felt his agony through the bond, a white-hot, searing brand in my own side that nearly made me lose consciousness. I worked with a feverish, desperate intensity, my fingers slick with his blood as I fished out the tiny, jagged shards of the spear. Every time I extracted a fragment, the golden light of the bond flared in a protective burst, sealing the raw muscle behind me. By the time the last shard clattered onto the stone floor, I was covered in sweat and gore, my limbs trembling from the sheer emotional drain. Silas had finally gone still, sinking into a deep, supernatural healing sleep. I sat back on my heels, my chest heaving as I watched the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. He was the king who had ordered the purges. He was the man who represented every law and every chain I had spent 3 years running from. And yet, as I looked at the sudden peace on his face, my wolf circled contentedly in my chest, her tail wagging in a slow, rhythmic thrum. I had saved my mate. But in doing so, I knew I had officially invited the wrath of the entire Shadow Pack to my doorstep. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Woods. I didn't have time to wash the blood from my hands before the air changed. A wolf's senses are a gift, but tonight they were a curse. The wind shifted, carrying a scent that was alien to the Blackwood Peaks. It was the smell of polished iron, wet leather, and the cold, metallic tang of professional killers. Iron Fang. My blood turned to ice. The Iron Fang were the Alpha King's elite guard, or they had been until they betrayed him. If they were here, it meant they hadn't just come to verify their handiwork, they had come to collect the head. I looked back at Silas. He was out cold, his massive frame motionless as his body used every ounce of energy to fight off the remaining silver poison. He wouldn't wake for hours. In his current state, he was a sitting duck, and I was just a rogue with a recurve bow and a cabin that was rapidly becoming a coffin. "Not today," I whispered, my voice a low, dangerous promise. I stepped out into the night, my fingers curling around the familiar grip of my bow. The blizzard had calmed into a steady, eerie snowfall, the moon struggling to peek through the heavy clouds. I moved like a ghost, my feet barely indenting the fresh powder. I knew these woods better than I knew my own face. Every gnarled root, every hidden drop, and every hollow log was an ally waiting to be used. I saw them through the skeletal branches of the pines, 3 of them. They moved in a tight tactical wedge, their eyes glowing a faint, predatory green in the darkness. They weren't shifting yet. They were arrogant enough to stay in human form, their silver-edged swords drawn and gleaming. "He's close," one of them rasped, his voice cutting through the crisp air. "I can smell the king's rot." And something else, a female, sweet like mountain lilies and sweat. "A rogue?" the second one spat, his tone dripping with disdain. "Kill her. Leave the body for the crows. We only need the king's heart to prove the deed is done." A surge of cold, calculated rage boiled in my chest. They talked about Silas like he was a carcass, and about me like I was a minor nuisance to be brushed aside. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know that a Silvermoon heir doesn't just run, she hunts. I climbed the ancient cedar near the clearing, my movements as silent as a falling feather. I notched an arrow, the tip coated in a dark, paralytic sap I'd harvested from the mountain's deepest caves. I didn't wait for them to reach the cabin. I waited until the lead scout stepped into the death circle, a deceptively thin patch of ice I knew sat over a hidden, freezing spring. Thwip! The arrow found its mark in his shoulder with sickening precision. He didn't even have time to scream before the paralytic hit his bloodstream and his legs gave out. He collapsed onto the ice, which shattered instantly, swallowing him into the dark water below. The other 2 spun around, their swords flashing in the moonlight as they searched the shadows. "Who's there? Show yourself, coward!" I didn't answer. I vanished into the dark canopy, moving to my next position before they could even track the trajectory of the shot. The hunt had begun, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't the prey. I was the nightmare in the trees. Chapter 5. The Ranger's Trap. The 2 remaining Iron Fang assassins didn't scream. They were professionals, drilled in the silent arts of the Shadow Pack's elite guard, but their silence was born of a fatal arrogance. They assumed a lone rogue female was playing a desperate game of hide-and-seek. They didn't realize I was the one who had designed the game, and I had no intention of losing. I moved through the canopy of the ancient pines, my breathing perfectly synchronized with the rhythmic rustle of the needles. Below me, the lead assassin, a brute with a jagged scar bisecting his nose, motioned for his partner to fan out. They were heading directly for the Devil's Throat, a narrow limestone shelf that appeared to be solid ground but was, in reality, a treacherous overhang of loose shale and packed ice. "She's up there," the scarred one hissed, his predatory eyes scanning the dark branches. "I can smell her fear." He was lying. My fear had burned away the moment Silas claimed me, replaced by something cold and sharp. What he smelled wasn't fear, it was the scent of the mountain itself. I reached into my quiver and withdrew a blunt-headed arrow wrapped in oil-soaked cloth. I didn't need to pierce their hearts with steel, I only needed to trigger the mountain's hunger. Thwip! The arrow didn't strike the man. It struck a precariously balanced boulder perched directly above the limestone shelf. The sound was like a massive bone snapping in the earth's jaw. For a heartbeat, the world went still. Then, the shelf gave way. The brute let out a startled, high-pitched yelp as the ground vanished beneath his boots. He plummeted into the obsidian darkness of the ravine, his body bouncing off the jagged rocks with sickening thuds before disappearing into the mist below. The final assassin spun around, his sword raised, his eyes wide with the sudden, frantic realization that he was no longer the hunter. "Show yourself!" he roared, his voice cracking with the first true taste of terror. "I am a soldier of the Shadow Throne. You are nothing but a gutter wolf." I dropped from the branches, landing 10 feet in front of him with the silent grace of a predatory cat. I didn't shift. I wanted him to see my human face. I wanted him to know that a gutter wolf was the last thing he would ever see. "The Shadow Throne belongs to the man in that cabin," I said, my voice as frigid as the ice beneath my feet. "And you? You're just a stain on my mountain." He lunged, his silver-edged blade whistling toward my neck in a desperate arc. I didn't flinch. Stepping into his guard, the Silvermoon instinct took over my limbs. I seized his sword arm, twisted it until the bone groaned, and drove my knee into his ribs with shattering force. As he gasped for air, I leaned in, my eyes flashing with a reflected violet light, a terrifying gift from the bond. "Tell the abyss that Elara Silvermoon sent you." I didn't even have to push him. He backed away in pure, unadulterated terror, his heel catching on the jagged edge of the gorge. He tumbled backward, his scream cut short by the howling wind. I stood at the precipice for a long time, watching the falling snow begin to bury their tracks. I had protected my mate. But as I turned back toward the cabin, a sharp, agonizing pulse in my chest told me the battle for Silas's life and his heart had only just begun. Chapter 6. The Power Clash. The cabin felt significantly smaller when I returned. The air was thick, saturated with the scent of ozone and the heavy, musky heat radiating from a healing alpha. Silas was no longer unconscious. He was sitting on the edge of my bed, his chest bare, the bandages I had so meticulously wrapped already straining against the rapid expansion of his recovering muscles. The moment I crossed the threshold, his head snapped toward me. The violet fire in his eyes was blinding, a primal, ancient force that demanded I drop to my knees in absolute supplication. "You left the cabin," he said. His voice wasn't merely a sound, it was a physical weight, a tectonic pressure that pressed the very air from my lungs. "I saved your life," I countered, dropping my bow onto the table with a defiant clatter that echoed in the small space. "The Iron Fang were at the door, Silas. If I hadn't gone out there, they would be measuring your head for a spike right now." Silas stood. He moved with a predatory, liquid grace that shouldn't have been physically possible for a man who had been impaled just hours ago. He crossed the room in 2 thunderous strides, looming over me until his shadow swallowed me whole. The bond between us hummed like a live wire, vibrating with his cold fury and, to my immense frustration, his overwhelming relief. "You are my mate," he growled, his hand reaching out to tilt my chin upward. His touch was electric, a searing heat that sent sparks dancing across my skin, branding me even as he touched me. "Your place is behind me, protected, not out in the dark fighting my battles." "I am a rogue, Silas," I spat, refusing to yield to his gaze. "I've spent 3 years fighting my own battles and winning them. I don't need a king to tell me where my place is. In this cabin, I am the alpha. You are merely a guest who happened to survive because I felt like playing healer." His grip tightened, his thumb brushing over my lower lip with a slow, deliberate pressure. The anger in his eyes shifted, darkening into something far more predatory. The alpha tone, that supernatural command that forces every shifter to obey the king's will, vibrated deep in his throat. "Kneel, Elara." The command hit me like a physical wave, a tidal force intended to crush my will. My knees trembled, and for a split second, my wolf whined in submission, wanting to bow before the King of the North. But then, the Silvermoon blood in my veins roared back with a silver-white heat. I shoved his hand away, my eyes flashing with a brilliance that rivaled his own. "I told you," I hissed, my voice trembling not with fear, but with raw, unadulterated rage. "Your commands died at the border of this mountain. I am not your subject, Silas Vane, and if you ever try to use that tone on me again, I will put you back in the snow exactly where I found you." For a long, agonizing minute, we stood chest to chest, the air between us crackling with enough static tension to light the hearth. Silas stared down at me, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of my defiance. Then, to my absolute shock, the corner of his mouth quirked into a dark, intrigued smirk. "A rogue with the heart of a queen," he whispered, his voice dropping to a low, possessive rumble that sent a different kind of shiver down my spine. "You think you're free of me, Elara? You don't understand the nature of this tether. The bond doesn't want your submission, it wants your soul, and I am going to take it, bit by agonizing bit." Chapter 7. The 3-mile limit. I couldn't breathe. The air in the cabin had become too heavy, saturated with Silas's scent and the suffocating weight of his violet eyes tracking my every heartbeat. It was all too much. The bond, the claim, the sudden loss of my hard-won independence. I waited until the moon reached its zenith and his breathing had smoothed into the steady, deep rhythm of a warrior's sleep. I didn't care about the blizzard outside or the iron fang lurking in the valley. I just needed to be away from the magnetic pull of the man who looked at me like I was his entire world. I packed a small satchel with dried meat and a skin of water, moving with the silence of a ghost. I didn't look back at the bed. I refused to look at the way the dying firelight played across his scarred, powerful shoulders. I slipped out into the biting night, my boots crunching softly on the frozen crust of the snow. I am Elara the Rogue, I told myself, a mantra to drown out the thrumming in my blood. I don't belong to anyone. 1 mile. The air was crisp and clean. The crushing weight in my chest felt slightly lighter, as if I were finally outrunning the tether. 2 miles. A strange, dull ache began to throb behind my ribs. I ignored it, jaw clenched, pushing through a thicket of frost-covered briars that clawed at my cloak. 2.5 miles. The ache became a burn. It felt like a hot coal had been shoved into my solar plexus, radiating a searing heat through my veins. My wolf began to whimper, a sound of pure, unadulterated distress that I had never heard from her before. Just a little further, I gasped, clutching my chest as I stumbled over a hidden root. It's just the cold. It's just the altitude. But at the 3-mile mark, the world ended. A scream tore from my throat as a white-hot spear of agony erupted in my heart. It felt as if an invisible iron chain, anchored deep in the center of my soul, had reached its limit and was now trying to rip my chest open. I collapsed into the snow, my vision fracturing into 1,000 jagged shards of gray. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. This was the bond sickness. The myth shifters spoke of in hushed, terrified tones. The physical punishment for fated mates who dared to defy the pull of the union. The universe didn't just want us together, it demanded it. "Silas," I gasped, my fingers clawing uselessly at the ice. I hated myself for saying his name, but my soul was screaming for him, crying out for the only source of heat that could stop the cold of death from claiming me. Through the haze of pain, I heard the steady, rhythmic crunch of boots on the snow. They weren't hurried. They were patient. Predatory. I looked up, my eyelashes heavy with frost. Silas was standing a few feet away, silhouetted against the pale, indifferent moonlight. He wasn't wearing a coat. The heat radiating from his alpha body was so intense it was melting the snowflakes before they could even touch his skin. He looked down at me, his expression unreadable, though a spark of dark, possessive triumph danced in his violet eyes. 3 miles, he said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. Most mates only make it 2. You really are a fighter, Elara. He knelt beside me, and the moment his hand touched my shoulder, the agony vanished instantly. It was replaced by a flood of warmth so intense I nearly lost consciousness from the sheer relief. I slumped against him, my face buried in his chest, hating the way my body betrayed my mind by seeking his comfort. "Go ahead," I whispered, my voice broken and defeated. "Tell me I belong to you." Silas wrapped his powerful arms around me, lifting me into his chest as if I weighed nothing more than a handful of snow. He leaned down, his lips brushing my forehead in a gesture that felt more like a brand than a kiss. "You don't just belong to me, Elara," he whispered into the dark, his voice a promise of fire and blood. "You are me, and as of tonight, the running is over. We have a throne to take back, and God help anyone who stands in our way." Chapter 8. The King's Vulnerability. The storm outside had finally died down to a rhythmic drumming against the cabin's cedar walls, but the atmosphere inside was far from calm. Silas was back on the furs, his breathing heavy and labored. He wasn't dying anymore, but the silver had left its mark. thin, spider-webbed scars that pulsed a faint, angry gray against his tan skin. For the first time, the invincible alpha looked human. The terrifying weight of his aura had retracted, leaving behind a man who looked haunted. I sat across from him, cleaning the blood from my hunting knife. The silence between us stretched thin like a bowstring. "Why did you do it?" I asked quietly. "A king doesn't get pinned to a rock in the middle of a blizzard unless someone he trusts holds the spear." Silas let out a hollow, dry laugh that turned into a wince. He stared up at the rafter, his violet eyes clouded with a raw, jagged grief. "Corvick. My beta. My brother in everything but blood. He didn't just stab me, Elara. He made me watch as his men burned the Loyalist barracks. He told me the Shadow Pack was tired of a king who ruled with honor and restraint. They wanted the valley. They wanted to expand, to crush the smaller packs. They wanted a war I wasn't willing to start. I felt a pang of something I didn't want to name: empathy. As a rogue, I knew what it was like to be cast out, but Silas had been betrayed by the very heart of his home. "He thinks I'm dead," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "He'll be sitting on my throne right now, drinking my wine and planning the slaughter of the borderlands. He thinks he's won because he took my crown." "And didn't he?" I asked, looking around my humble one-room cabin. "You're a king of dust and snow now, Silas." He turned his head toward me, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. The vulnerability I'd seen moments ago vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating fire. "A king isn't made by a crown, Elara. He's made by his blood, and by his mate." He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of my sleeve. "Corvick took my kingdom, but the fates gave me you. He has no idea that he's just traded a throne for his own executioner." I pulled my arm away, but the bond hummed in my chest, a treacherous warmth that told me I was already part of his war. I wasn't just Elara the Ranger anymore. I was the secret weapon of a fallen king. Chapter 9. A Rogue's Past. I thought I had hidden it well. For 3 years I'd worn high collars and heavy cloaks, never letting anyone see the small, silver-white mark on my left shoulder. It was a birthmark, but in our world, it was a death sentence. I was reaching for a kettle of water when my tunic slipped just an inch. It was only for a second, but in that second, Silas was there. He moved with a speed that defied his injuries, his hand clamping onto my shoulder. He didn't pull me close this time. He just stared at the mark. It was shaped like a perfect, slender crescent moon, shimmering with a faint, iridescent light that seemed to glow under the skin. "The Silvermoon lineage," Silas whispered, his voice thick with a shock that bordered on awe. "The lineage of the High Seers, the family that was supposed to rule the North alongside the Vanes before the Great Purge." I wrenched myself away, pulling my tunic up to hide it, my heart hammering against my ribs. "That family is dead, Silas. My father, my mother, they were slaughtered in their beds because they wouldn't bow to your father. I'm just a rogue. I'm nobody." "Nobody?" Silas stepped toward me, his eyes flaring with a violet intensity that demanded the truth. "The Silvermoon heirs weren't just royals, Elara. They were the balance. My line brought the shadow and the strength, but yours brought the light and the vision. My father didn't kill yours because of a grudge. He killed them because he was afraid of a power he couldn't control." "Well, he succeeded," I spat, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I have no power. I have no vision. I just have a cabin, and a life that was finally quiet until you crashed into it." "You're wrong," Silas said, his voice dropping to a possessive, soul-deep growl. "You think the bond chose us by accident? You think the King of the Shadows and the last daughter of the Silvermoons just happened to find each other in a storm?" He leaned in, his breath hot against my ear, sending shivers of terror and desire down my spine. "The stars don't make mistakes, Elara. You're not just my mate. You're the missing half of my soul. And together, we aren't just going to take back a pack. We're going to rewrite the history of the North." Chapter 10. The Moonlight Hunt. The tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point. Silas was restless, his wolf pacing beneath his skin like a caged beast, and my own wolf was starting to respond to his frustration. The bond sickness had anchored us together, but the walls were starting to feel like a cage. "You're getting slow, Alpha," I challenged, grabbing my cloak. "If you're going to be a king again, you need to be able to catch a rogue in the dark. Let's see if those bandages are holding you back." I didn't wait for an answer. I burst through the door and shifted mid-stride. My wolf was smaller than a typical pack wolf, sleek, agile, and fur as white as a fresh snowfall. I didn't have the brute strength of a Vane, but I had the speed of the Silvermoons. I tore through the woods, my paws barely touching the frozen ground, the moon overhead a silver beacon through the trees. A heartbeat later, a massive, terrifying roar shook the forest. The shadow Alpha had shifted. Silas's wolf was a nightmare made of fur and muscle. He was pure black, a void in the moonlight, his eyes twin violet suns. He didn't run like I did. He moved like a landslide, trees snapping beneath his weight as he pursued me. The bond acted like a physical tether between us, a golden thread that thrummed with the joy of the chase. I led him through the densest thickets, over frozen streams and up the jagged rock faces where my smaller size gave me the advantage. I could feel his heat behind me, the sheer power of his lungs as he inhaled my scent. He wasn't hunting to kill, he was hunting to own. I ducked under a fallen cedar, planning to double back, but Silas was faster than any man his size should be. He didn't follow me under the tree, he leaped over it, a massive shadow that blotted out the stars. He pinned me beneath the cedar, his massive paws on either side of my shoulders. He didn't growl. He let out a low, vibrating chuff that made my whole body tremble. We were both panting, our steam mingling in the freezing air. He lowered his muzzle to my neck, his hot breath ruffling my white fur. In that moment, the war and the throne didn't matter. There was only the moon, the snow, and the absolute primal recognition of our wolves. My wolf didn't want to run anymore. She leaned her head back, exposing her throat, an act of trust that made Silas's wolf go still. He didn't bite. He licked the side of my neck, a slow, possessive rasp of his tongue that sent a jolt of pure electricity through my core. We shifted back simultaneously, lying in the snow, gasping for air. "You're fast," Silas rasped, his eyes never leaving mine. "And you're loud," I replied, though I couldn't stop the small smile tugging at my lips. "I caught you, Elara," he whispered, leaning over me, his face inches from mine. "I'll always catch you." Chapter 11. Scent of Obsession. We returned to the cabin as the first hint of gray began to touch the horizon. The atmosphere had changed. The sharp edge of our rivalry had been replaced by a heavy, languid heat. Silas didn't go back to the furs. Instead, he began to walk the perimeter of the room, his movements slow and deliberate. I watched him, my heart skip-beating, as he touched the doorframe, the hearth, and even the chair where I sat. He was marking, not with physical markers, but with his scent, that intoxicating sandalwood and storm. He was literally weaving his presence into the wood and stone of my home. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sounding breathier than I intended. "Making sure the world knows where I am," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "And who I'm with." He stopped in front of me, his shadow stretching across the floor. He didn't touch me, but the air between us felt charged with enough static to start a fire. He leaned down, his face hovering just an inch from the crook of my neck. He inhaled deeply, a long, slow draw of breath that seemed to pull the very air from my lungs. "Everything in this cabin smells like you, Elara," he murmured against my skin. "Your herbs, your pine, your wildness. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever scented, but it's incomplete." He leaned in closer, his nose grazing the sensitive skin just below my ear. "Soon, the world won't be able to tell where you end and I begin. Every inch of this mountain, every inch of you, will smell like us." It was a claim more powerful than any words. He was turning my sanctuary into a den. Our den. My wolf should have been howling in protest at the loss of her independence, but instead she was purring, circling contentedly in the warmth of his presence. I looked up at him, my eyes searching his violet gaze. "You don't do anything halfway, do you?" "When it comes to my queen?" Silas's hand finally came up, his palm cupping my cheek with a tenderness that was more frightening than his anger. "Never." He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, and for the first time, I didn't pull away. I let myself breathe him in, letting the scent of the Shadow King anchor me to a future I was no longer sure I wanted to escape. Chapter 12. The Stolen Radio. The peace of the morning was shattered not by a scream, but by the hollow, metallic crackle of a hidden machine. I had kept an old shortwave radio tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the hearth, a relic from my father's time. It was the only way I kept tabs on the world I had left behind. Silas watched with dark curiosity as I pried the board up and began to turn the rusted dial. Static filled the cabin, a harsh, jagged sound that made Silas's wolf growl in his chest. Then, through the white noise, a voice broke through. It was a voice like broken glass and cold iron. Corvic. "Citizens of the Shadow Realm, the period of mourning is over," the radio hissed. "Though we grieve the loss of Silas Vane, we do not grieve the weakness he brought to our borders. As of this sunrise, the Shadow Pack is no longer a kingdom of peace. We are a kingdom of conquest. Our scouts have already moved into the neutral lands. Any pack that does not offer total fealty by the next full moon will be erased from the maps." I felt the temperature in the cabin drop 20 degrees. Silas didn't move, but the wood of the table beneath his hand began to splinter. His knuckles were white, his eyes turning a violet so dark they were almost black. "Furthermore," Corvic's voice continued, a sickening edge of triumph in his tone, "we are hunting the Silvermoon ghost, the rogue who stole the king's body from the battlefield. A bounty of 10,000 gold pieces is placed on her head. Bring her to me alive so she can watch as I burn her mountain to the ground." I reached out and snapped the radio off, the silence that followed feeling heavier than the static. My hands were trembling. I wasn't just a rogue anymore. I was a prize. I was a target. "He's using my name to justify a massacre," Silas whispered, his voice a terrifyingly calm vibration. "He's using the death he gave me to build a throne of corpses." "He knows you're alive, Silas," I said, looking at him. "He doesn't want the Silvermoon heir just for the bounty. He knows if we're together, his rule is over. He's afraid." Silas stood up, his massive frame blotting out the light from the small window. He didn't look like a wounded man anymore. He looked like an apex predator who had just found his target. "Let him be afraid," Silas growled, his aura flaring until the cabin walls groaned. "He wants to burn the mountain? Let him try. I am the shadow that the fire cannot touch, and he has no idea that the king he killed is coming back with a queen who can see through his every lie." Chapter 13. Fevered Touch. That night, the air in the cabin was charged with more than just the threat of Corvic's army. The bond sickness was shifting. It wasn't just about the physical pain of distance anymore, it was the psychological ache of proximity. Every time Silas moved, every time he breathed, I felt it in my own lungs. The bond was screaming for completion. I tried to stay on my side of the room, focused on sharpening my arrows, but the hearth felt cold, even with a roaring fire. I could feel Silas watching me from the shadows of the bed. His gaze was a physical weight, a heat that made my skin itch. "You're shaking, Elara," he said, his voice a low, bedroom rasp. "I'm cold," I lied, though sweat was beaded at my hairline. "Liar." He stood up and walked toward me. He didn't stop until he was standing directly behind my chair. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the radiant heat coming off his body. It was intoxicating. "The bond isn't just a tether, little moon. It's a hunger. And right now, yours is starving." I don't want to need you," I whispered, my eyes closing as I felt him lean down. "It's not about want," he murmured, his hands finally settling on my shoulders. The contact was like a lightning strike. A jolt of pure, golden energy surged through me, silencing the frantic pacing of my wolf. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, my head falling back against his stomach. His hands were large and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he began to knead the tension from my muscles. "Stop fighting the stars, Elara," he whispered, his lips grazing the shell of my ear. "Your soul recognized mine the moment you touched that spear. You saved my life because you couldn't breathe without me. Admit it." I turned in the chair, looking up at him. The violet fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability that mirrored my own. We were two broken pieces of a royal lineage, held together by a magic we didn't understand. I reached up, my fingers brushing the dark stubble on his jaw. "I hate that you're right. I hate that I can feel your heart beating inside my own chest." "Then don't hate it," Silas whispered, his hand sliding into my hair, pulling me upward until I was standing, flushed against him. "Just feel it." Chapter 14. The First Kiss. The world narrowed down to the space between our lips. The blizzard outside was a distant memory. The threat of Corvic, the bounty on my head, the stolen throne, it all evaporated in the heat of Silas's gaze. "Elara," he murmured, my name sounding like a sacred vow in his mouth. "Don't talk," I whispered. "Just, please." I was the one who closed the distance. I reached up, my fingers tangling in the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down. When our lips finally met, it wasn't a gentle introduction. It was an explosion. It was the collision of two celestial bodies, a release of 3 years of isolation and a week of agonizing tension. The golden light of the bond flared between us, so bright I could see it through my closed eyelids. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a conversation. I felt his grief, his rage, and his sudden, overwhelming obsession with me. He tasted like sandalwood, honey, and the coming storm. Silas let out a low, guttural growl, his arms wrapping around my waist and lifting me off my feet. He pressed me against the sturdy wood of the cabin door, his body a wall of solid muscle and heat. His kiss was possessive, desperate, and deep, a king reclaiming his most precious treasure. Every touch felt like a brand. My wolf was howling in pure, unadulterated joy, finally finding the anchor she had been searching for. I felt the Silvermoon power in my blood react to his shadow energy, the two forces swirling together in a dance of light and dark. For a moment, I saw a vision, not of the past, but of a future where we stood together on a balcony of white stone, the north bowing at our feet. But the vision was cut short. A low, mournful howl echoed from the base of the mountain. It wasn't a wolf's howl, it was the sound of a hunting horn, the iron fang. We pulled apart, both of us gasping for air, the golden light of the bond still shimmering on our skin. Silas's eyes were violet suns, his chest heaving. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a man who had finally found something worth dying for. "They're here," I whispered, my hand reaching for my bow. "Let them come," Silas growled, his voice shifting into the resonance of the alpha. He stepped in front of me, his massive body shielding me from the door. "They think they've come for a rogue and a dead king. They have no idea they've just walked into the jaws of the moon and the shadow." He turned to me, a dark, lethal smile playing on his lips. "Ready to show them what a Silvermoon queen can do?" Chapter 15. Breaking Cover. The smoke from my hearth was the first thing to go. I had to douse the fire with snow, watching as the embers hissed and died, a cold metaphor for the life I was leaving behind. The Iron Fang horns were getting closer, their mournful, low brass notes vibrating through the valley walls. They weren't just hunting a rogue anymore, they were hunting a king. "The cabin is compromised," I said, my voice tight as I stuffed a final skin of water into my pack. I looked around the small, wooden room. For 3 years, this had been my entire world. Every scratch on the table, every bundle of drying sage was a piece of the peace I had fought so hard to build. Now, it was just a target. Silas stood by the door, his silhouette blocking out what little moonlight filtered through the trees. He had donned a dark, hooded cloak I'd fashioned from elk hide, but it did little to hide the sheer magnetic power radiating from him. He looked like a god of shadows waiting for the sun to set. "We leave through the Greystone Ravine," Silas commanded, though his voice lacked the abrasive edge of his earlier alpha tone. There was a new resonance there, a shared understanding. It's a steep climb, but it's the only path the Iron Fang's horses can't follow. If we reach the neutral lands by dawn, we can blend into the trade caravans. I grabbed my bow, the wood cool and familiar in my hand. The neutral lands aren't safe for a Silvermoon, Silas. There are wolves there who would sell their own mothers for a handful of Corvix's gold. Silas stepped toward me, his hand coming up to cup the back of my neck. His thumb brushed the sensitive skin just behind my ear, sending a jolt of warmth through the bond that quieted my racing heart. "They won't be looking for a Silvermoon queen and her king," he whispered, his violet eyes swirling with a dark protective fire. "They'll be looking for two rogues trying to survive the winter. Let them look. By the time they realize who we are, we'll be at the castle gates." I looked at the hearth one last time. "I'm never coming back here, am I?" Silas leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. "No. But where we're going, you won't need a cabin to feel safe. You have the shadow at your back now, Elara, and I don't let go of what is mine." We stepped out into the biting cold, the door clicking shut behind us with a finality that felt like a death knell. We vanished into the trees, just as the first flicker of torches appeared at the base of my mountain. Chapter 16. The Neutral Pack. The Neutral Lands was a scar on the map, a lawless, sprawling valley where the borders of the four great packs met. It was a place of mud, iron, and desperation. As we descended the final ridge, the smell of wood smoke and unwashed fur hit me like a physical blow, a sharp contrast to the clean, pine-scented air of my heights. The town of Oakhaven was nothing more than a collection of stone hovels and timber taverns built into the side of a cliff. It was a haven for outcasts, mercenaries, and spies. "Keep your hood up," I whispered to Silas as we navigated the crowded central market. "And for the love of the moon, dim your aura. You're radiating alpha like a lighthouse." Silas grunted, pulling the elk hide cloak tighter. "It's hard to act like a cur when I'm surrounded by vultures, Elara. The scent of betrayal in this place is thick enough to choke on." We pushed through the heavy oak doors of the Shattered Claw, a tavern that smelled of spilled ale and wet dog. The room went silent for a heartbeat as we entered, the instinct of every predator in the room sensing a higher power. I led Silas to a dark corner booth, my hand resting on the hilt of my dagger. A massive wolf with a scarred eye and a tattered leather vest approached us, slamming 2 mugs of bitter-smelling brew onto the table. He leaned in, his nose twitching as he caught Silas's scent. "You smell like royalty and mountain rot, stranger," the scarred wolf rasped, his voice a low growl. "We don't like royalty in Oakhaven. It brings soldiers, and soldiers bring questions we don't want to answer." Silas didn't look up, but the air around our table grew heavy, the shadows in the corners seeming to lengthen and twist. "We aren't here for your politics, mutt. We're here for a room and 12 hours of silence, unless you'd like to see what mountain rot can do to a throat." The scarred wolf flinched, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Silas's gaze. He took the gold coin I slid across the table and retreated without another word. "You're not helping," I hissed, taking a sip of the foul brew. "I don't play well with others," Silas replied, his eyes scanning the room with lethal efficiency. "But look there, by the hearth. Isn't that one of yours?" I followed his gaze and felt my heart skip a beat. Sitting by the fire, nursing a drink, was Jackson, a wolf I had saved from a silver trap 2 years ago. He was the closest thing I had to a friend in the rogue world. But as he looked up and caught my eye, he didn't smile. He looked at Silas, then at the door, and a flash of pure, cold greed crossed his face. Chapter 17. A Test of Loyalty. Jackson approached our table with a practiced, easy smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Elara? By the mother, I thought the mountain had finally swallowed you whole. And who is your formidable friend. "Just a traveler, Jackson," I said, my voice neutral, though my wolf was pacing in my chest, her hackles raised. "We're just passing through. We need news of the capital." Jackson slid into the booth beside me, his scent heavy with the smell of cheap tobacco and something sour. Fear. "The capital is a hornet's nest. Corvick has doubled the patrols. He's looking for a ghost and a thief. Word is, the reward is enough to buy a lordship in the Southern Isles." Silas leaned forward, the hood of his cloak falling back just enough to reveal the hard, predatory line of his jaw. "And is Jackson the type of man who fancies himself a lord?" Jackson laughed, but it was a thin, brittle sound. "I'm a man who likes to stay alive, stranger. Elara, you know me. I owe you my life. I wouldn't sell you out for all the gold in the shadow vaults." He reached out to pat my hand, but Silas moved faster. He caught Jackson's wrist in a grip that made the bones creak. The tavern went silent again, the tension thick enough to spark. "You're lying," Silas whispered, his violet eyes burning with a terrifying clarity. "Your heart is erratic. Your scent is foul with treachery. You've already sent word, haven't you?" Jackson's face went pale, his eyes darting to the tavern door. I had no choice. They have my sister. Corvick's men, they—" The door to the shattered claw was kicked open, the hinges screaming. 6 wolves in the black and iron armor of the Iron Fang burst in, their crossbows leveled. "Jackson, you coward," I whispered, pulling my dagger. "I'm sorry, Elara." Jackson scrambled out of the booth, heading for the back exit. Silas stood up, his cloak falling away to reveal the massive, scarred king beneath. He didn't shift. He didn't need to. He grabbed a heavy wooden chair and shattered it against the first soldier's head before they could even fire. "Stay behind me," Silas roared, his alpha aura exploding through the room, knocking over tables and sending the tavern patrons screaming for the exits. But as I notched an arrow, I saw a 7th soldier in the rafters. He wasn't holding a standard bolt. He was aiming a specialized heavy crossbow, one loaded with a jagged, shimmering arrow of pure, unrefined silver. And he wasn't aiming for me. He was aiming for Silas's heart. Chapter 18. The Silver Arrow. Time didn't slow down. It fractured. I saw the archer's finger tighten on the trigger. I saw the glint of the moonlight on the silver tip, a metal designed to rot an alpha from the inside out. Silas was occupied, his back turned as he snapped the neck of a soldier who had tried to lunge at him with a mace. He couldn't see the threat. He couldn't feel the trajectory, but I could. The Silvermoon blood in my veins didn't just give me sight, it gave me a connection to the flow of the world. I saw the path of the bolt before it even left the string. If it hit Silas, in his still recovering state, he wouldn't survive a second time. The Shadow King would fall, and the North would burn. I didn't think. I didn't calculate the cost. My body moved on an instinct older than my own life. "Silas, no!" I threw myself across the space between us. The sound of the crossbow firing was a sharp mechanical thwack that seemed to echo inside my skull. I felt the impact before I felt the pain. It wasn't a piercing sensation. It was a cold, numbing shock that slammed into my shoulder and threw me backward. I hit the floor hard, the world spinning into a kaleidoscope of red and gray. Pure, unadulterated agony, not from Elara, but from Silas. The bond didn't just transmit my pain, it amplified it. Silas's roar wasn't human, and it wasn't wolf. It was something ancient and terrible. I watched through a haze as he shifted midair, a massive wall of black fur and violet fire that didn't just attack the soldiers, he annihilated them. He was a whirlwind of claws and teeth, driven by a blood rage that turned the tavern into a ruin in seconds. The archer in the rafters didn't even have time to reload. Silas leaped 15 feet into the air, his jaws closing around the man's throat before they both crashed back to the floor. Then, the silence returned, heavy and smelling of copper and burnt silver. Silas shifted back, his skin slick with sweat and the blood of his enemies. He scrambled toward me on his hands and knees, his face a mask of absolute terror. Elara, look at me!" I tried to speak, but my lungs felt like they were filled with dry ice. I looked down at my shoulder. The arrow was buried deep, the silver filigree already beginning to hiss against my skin, turning my veins into black, pulsing wires. "You stupid wolf," I managed to whisper, a red froth bubbling at my lips. Silas gathered me into his arms, his hands shaking. The king who feared nothing was trembling like a leaf in a storm. "Why? Why would you do this? You're a rogue. You were supposed to run." "Can't run." From my heart, I murmured, my vision starting to fail. The silver was moving fast, heading for my spine. I felt Silas press his forehead against mine, his tears hot against my skin. The bond between us, once a golden thread, was now a bridge of fire. "I won't let you go," Silas growled, his voice vibrating with a desperate power. "Do you hear me, Elara? You are the Silvermoon Queen. You do not die in a gutter. You stay with me." Chapter 19. Healing Hands. The world was fading into a fractured mosaic of gray and cold. I was no longer in the tavern. Silas had carried me to a damp, hidden cave beneath the cliffside, the sound of a distant waterfall masking our location. But I couldn't hear the water. All I could hear was the frantic, thundering drum of Silas's heart against my ear. He laid me down on a flat stone, his hands moving over my wound with a desperate, trembling speed. The silver arrow was still lodged in my shoulder, and the skin around it had turned a sickly, translucent black. The poison was a parasite, feeding on my life force, and I could feel my wolf retreating into the deepest, darkest corner of my mind to escape the rot. "Look at me, Elara," Silas commanded, his voice raw and cracked. "Stay in your eyes. Don't go into the dark." "It's so cold, Silas," I whispered. My breath hitched, a rattle in my chest that terrified me. Silas didn't hesitate. He knew that as a Silvermoon, my body couldn't fight off the silver like a high-born shadow wolf could. I was fading. He reached out and gripped the shaft of the arrow, his knuckles white. With a guttural roar of shared pain, he ripped the silver from my flesh. I screamed, a sound that tore through the cave, but the scream was cut short, as Silas pressed his palms directly over the bleeding, poisoned wound. "I am the King of Shadows," he hissed, his eyes glowing with a violet fire so intense it illuminated the entire cave. "And I do not permit this death." Suddenly, the bond didn't just hum, it exploded. I felt a surge of white-hot, agonizingly beautiful energy pour from Silas's hands into my veins. It was his own alpha life force, the raw, golden power that gave him the right to rule. He was pouring his strength into me, acting as a filter for the poison. I arched off the stone, my fingers clawing at his forearms. It felt like my blood was being replaced by liquid sun. I could see the black veins on my arm beginning to turn gold, the silver poison being pushed back by the sheer, stubborn will of the man holding me. Silas gasped, his face turning pale as he transferred his vitality to me. His breath came in ragged shudders, and I realized with a jolt of horror that he was giving too much. He was draining himself to keep my heart beating. "Silas, stop," I managed to choke out. You'll die." "Then we die together," he growled, his forehead dropping against mine. "But you will not leave me behind in this world, Elara. Not now, not ever." As the last of the poison was neutralized, the golden light faded into a soft, pulsing warmth. My wound began to knit together, leaving behind a faint, silvery scar. I slumped back, gasping for air, the cold finally replaced by a deep, bone-settling heat. Silas collapsed beside me, his strength spent, but his hand remained locked in mine. We were no longer just mates. We were bloodbound by a sacrifice that had rewritten our souls. Chapter 20. The Truth Unveiled. Hours passed in a heavy, exhausted silence. The waterfall outside continued its mournful song, and the cave grew dim as the sun began to set. Silas was recovering, the color returning to his face, but he wouldn't let me more than an inch away from him. The bond was hypersensitive now, vibrating with a frequency that made my skin tingle. "Why did you do it, Elara?" Silas asked, his voice low and steady. He was staring at the ceiling of the cave, his hand still tracing the new scar on my shoulder. You spent 3 years running from the Shadow Pack. You hate my laws, you hate my throne. Why would you take a silver arrow for the man who represents everything you lost? I sat up slowly, the movement no longer painful, but my heart felt heavy. The time for secrets was over. The silver had stripped away my defenses, leaving the raw truth exposed. I didn't do it for a king, Silas, I said, looking into his violet eyes. And I didn't just run because of your laws. I ran because of my father. Before he died, he was a high seer. He saw the prophecy of the moon and the shadow. Silas sat up, his brow furrowed. The prophecy? Our lines were meant to rule together. That's not a secret. That's the version the history books kept, I whispered, my voice trembling. The true prophecy, the one my father died to protect, was darker. It said that the union of the Silvermoon and the Shadow would be the greatest power the North had ever seen. But it also said there was a price. For one to truly rule in power, the other must be the sacrifice. Silas went still, his hand tightening on mine. My father saw a vision of you and me, Silas, I continued, tears finally spilling over. He saw us standing on the high tower, and he saw one of us falling. He thought that if I stayed, I would be the one to die to give you your crown. He sent me away to save my life. I've spent every day of the last 3 years believing that if I ever let you claim me, it would be my death warrant. Silas didn't pull away. He leaned in, his thumbs catching my tears, his expression a mix of fury and devastating tenderness. Your father saw a shadow of a possibility, Elara, he said, his voice dropping to a soul-deep rumble. But he didn't know the man I would become. I don't care about a crown that requires your blood. If the stars want a sacrifice, let them take me. But I am not ruling a world that doesn't have you in it. Chapter 21. The Fated Queen. The revelation of the prophecy should have driven us apart, but instead it seemed to fuse us into a single, unbreakable unit. We stepped out of the cave as the moon rose, a pale, silver sliver that seemed to watch us with ancient curiosity. I looked toward the horizon, where the jagged spires of the Shadow Pack castle cut into the sky like broken teeth. It was leagues away, but for the first time it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a destination. We can't just walk in, I said, my Silvermoon instincts beginning to sharpen, the fog of the poison completely gone. Corvick will have the gates barred and the walls lined with archers. He's expecting a wounded king. He's not expecting a revolution. Silas stood tall beside me, his alpha aura returning with a vengeance. He didn't look like the dying man I'd found in the snow. He looked like a god of war, restored by the very woman he was destined to protect. Then we won't give him a wounded king, Silas said, turning to me. He took my hand and raised it to his lips, his gaze never leaving mine. You are Elara Silvermoon, the last high seer, the woman who took a silver arrow and lived. You aren't a rogue hiding in the trees anymore. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in velvet. He unfolded it to reveal a signet ring, the royal seal of the Shadow Pack. He slid it onto my finger. It was too large, but the moment it touched my skin, it shrunk, the dark metal glowing with a faint violet light. By the laws of the North and the blood in my veins, Silas declared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, I claim you not just as my mate, but as my queen. My equal in every command, my partner in every shadow. From this moment on, your word is my law. I felt a surge of power, real, tangible power, rush through me. It wasn't just the bond. It was the weight of the lineage I had tried to deny. My wolf let out a long, triumphant howl that seemed to pull the very moonlight down toward us. We aren't just going back for a throne, Silas, I said, my voice steady and cold. We're going back to end Corvic. We're going back to show them that the shadow and the moon cannot be broken." "Exactly." Silas smirked, a dark, lethal glint in his eyes. "But first, we need an army. And I know exactly where to find the wolves who are hungry enough to bite the hand that feeds them." We turned toward the Deadwood Dells, the lawless outskirts of the kingdom. As we walked, a massive signal fire erupted on the highest peak of the Shadow Mountains. Corvic was calling his banners. The war wasn't coming anymore. It was here. Chapter 22. The Shadow Outcasts. The Deadwood Dells were not just a place, they were a scar on the soul of the kingdom. As Silas and I descended into the lowlands, the air grew thick with the smell of stagnant water and rotting timber. This was where the Shadow Pack sent its unfixables, the wolves with broken limbs, the ones whose spirits had been crushed, and the rogues who weren't lucky enough to find a mountain sanctuary like mine. "It's worse than I remembered," Silas whispered, his voice vibrating with a suppressed fury. He pulled his hood low, but his alpha aura was impossible to fully suppress. It rippled off him in waves of cold tension, causing the dead leaves at his feet to frost over. Small, emaciated figures began to emerge from the hollowed-out trunks of gray trees. These were the Shadow Outcasts. They were covered in rags, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a long-buried hunger. They didn't see a king, they saw a threat. "Who comes to the Dells with the scent of the high throne on their skin?" a raspy voice called out. An old wolf, his muzzle gray and his left eye clouded with a cataract, stepped forward. He leaned on a staff made of bone, his scent sour with age and sickness. Silas stepped forward, throwing back his hood. The violet fire in his eyes flared, illuminating the gloomy clearing. "I am Silas Vane, and I have not come here to look down on you." A collective gasp rippled through the clearing. Some wolves fell to their knees in instinctive submission. Others bared their teeth, remembering the king who had allowed them to be exiled. "You're dead," the old wolf hissed. "Corvic showed us the spear. He said the shadow was gone." "Corvic is a liar who stabs his brothers in the dark," Silas roared, his voice shaking the very trees. "He thinks you are trash to be thrown away. He thinks I am a ghost. But I am standing here, and I have brought the moon with me." He reached for my hand, pulling me forward. The Silvermoon signet ring on my finger glowed with a soft, ethereal light, and the mark on my shoulder hummed. "This is Elara Silvermoon," Silas declared, "the last heir of the Seers. We haven't come to ask for your loyalty. We've come to offer you something Corvic never will, a chance to hunt the hunters. We are building an army of shadows, and if you can still draw breath, you have a place in it." The old wolf looked from the glowing ring to Silas's face. Slowly, he knelt, pressing his forehead into the mud. One by one, the Dells came alive as hundreds of forgotten wolves emerged from the darkness, their eyes igniting with a new, dangerous hope. Chapter 23. Training the Pack. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For a week, the Dells became a grueling boot camp. Silas handled the formation and the raw power, but I was the one who taught them how to survive. These weren't elite soldiers, they were scavengers. So, I taught them to fight like scavengers. "Strength isn't just about how hard you can bite," I shouted, pacing in front of a line of 50 scrawny wolves. I held up a small, jagged piece of flint. "The Iron Fang expects a frontal assault. They expect you to shift and roar and die like honorable fools. But we are rogues. We are the shadows that bite from the dark." I spent hours teaching them how to use the terrain, how to rig a tripwire with mountain vine, how to scent an alpha from 2 miles away, and how to stay in human form to maximize their agility in the dense brush. Silas watched from the ridge, his arms crossed over his massive chest. I could feel his gaze through the bond, a mixture of pride and something deeper, a quiet obsession that grew every time I took command. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, he approached me, his boots crunching on the frost. "You're a natural leader, Elara," he said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate rumble that always made my pulse quicken. "They don't just follow you because of the ring. They follow you because you're one of them. You didn't come from a palace, you came from the dirt, just like they did." "I'm just teaching them what I had to learn to stay alive, Silas," I said, wiping sweat from my brow. "If we take them to the castle and they try to fight like a standard pack, they'll be slaughtered." Silas reached out, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw. "They won't be slaughtered, because they aren't fighting for a throne anymore. They're fighting for a queen who gave them their pride back." He leaned in, his breath hot against my ear. "And I'm fighting for the woman who saved my soul. Do you have any idea how dangerous that makes us?" I looked at the camp below, at the fires being lit and the sound of whetstones against blades. We were a pack of ghosts and outcasts, led by a fallen king and a rogue seer. It was the most beautiful, terrifying thing I had ever seen. Chapter 24. A Night of Submission. The night before we were set to move toward the capital, the air was unnervingly still. The camp was quiet, the outcasts sleeping in preparation for the march. I was sitting by a small, dying fire when Silas approached. He didn't sit beside me. To my absolute shock, the Alpha King of the North stepped into the center of the light and lowered himself to one knee. My heart stopped. An Alpha never kneels, not to his subjects, and rarely even to his mate. It is a total relinquishing of the predatory ego. "Silas, what are you doing?" I whispered, looking around frantically. "Someone will see you." "Let them," Silas said, his voice as steady as the mountain. He bowed his head, exposing the back of his neck, the most vulnerable part of a shifter's body. I spent my life believing that an Alpha's word was the only law that mattered. I thought that power was something you took and held with a fist. But this week, seeing you with these people, I realized I was a king, but I wasn't a leader. I stood up, my hand trembling as I reached for him. The bond between us was vibrating with a frequency of pure, unadulterated respect. "You're the one who gathered them, Silas. You're the one who gave them a reason to fight." "No," he said, looking up at me, his violet eyes swirling with a raw emotion that made my breath hitch. "I gave them a reason. You gave them a heart. I am a sword, Elara, a powerful, blunt instrument of destruction, but you are the vision. You see the path through the shadows that I would just try to smash through." He took my hand, the one wearing the Silvermoon ring, and pressed it to his forehead. "I am your mate, and I am your king, but tonight I am your first soldier. I submit my will to yours, Elara. Lead us, not as my consort, but as my equal, as my queen." The weight of his submission hit me like a physical force. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the moment our powers truly fused. The Silvermoon light and the Vane shadow weren't fighting for dominance anymore. They were merging. I pulled him up, my fingers tangling in his dark hair. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I kissed him with everything I was, all the rogue's defiance, all the seer's vision, and all the love I had tried so hard to deny. In that moment, we weren't just two wolves in a camp. We were the beginning of a new world. Chapter 25. The Traitor's Message. The moment of peace was shattered by a sharp, high-pitched whistle from the canopy. A large, dark hawk spiraled down from the moonlit sky, landing on a branch directly above us. It wasn't a wild bird. It wore a leather cuff on its leg with the crest of the high throne. Silas's face hardened instantly. "That's Lyra's bird." Lyra was Silas's younger sister, the only member of the royal family Corvick had kept alive, likely as a hostage to ensure any remaining loyalists stayed in line. Silas untied the small parchment tube with shaking fingers. The message was scrawled in a frantic, uneven hand, the ink smudged in places as if it had been written in a hurry. "Silas," the letter began, "if you are reading this, the rumors are true and you are alive. But you must stay away. Corvick has gone mad. He is planning a purge of the moon for the night of the eclipse. He knows about the Silvermoon heir. He has gathered the Iron Fang and a group of mercenaries from the south. He intends to execute every remaining Silvermoon loyalist in the city to draw you out. He says if the moon dies, the shadow belongs to him forever. Please, save yourself." Silas crushed the parchment in his fist, a low, guttural growl vibrating in his chest that made the nearby campfire flare up. "He's going to slaughter them, my people, your people, just to prove a point." "The eclipse is in 2 days," I said, my mind racing through the tactical maps I'd memorized. "If we march now, we can reach the capital by tomorrow night, but we won't have the element of surprise if we come with an army." "Then we don't come with an army," Silas said, his eyes turning a lethal, glowing violet. "We infiltrate, we get inside the walls, we save Lyra, and we open the gates from the inside. Then, the outcasts can flood the city." "It's a suicide mission," I whispered. "No," Silas said, looking at me with a dark, determined smirk. "It's a masquerade. Corvick is throwing a ball to celebrate his official coronation. The whole city will be distracted. It's the perfect time for a couple of ghosts to join the party." Chapter 26. The Masquerade. The capital city of Vane's Hold was a sprawling fortress of black stone and silver-veined marble, but tonight it was draped in the gaudy silks of a celebration it didn't want. Corvick had ordered a masquerade to mask the fear of the populace, turning the castle into a den of velvet and hidden faces. I stood in the shadows of the servants' entrance, my breath hitching as I looked at my reflection in a shard of glass. Silas had managed to secure a dress of deep, midnight blue silk through a contact in the city, a gown that hugged my curves and allowed for a hidden dagger at my thigh. A silver mask, intricate and cold, covered the upper half of my face, hiding the Silvermoon light in my eyes. Beside me, Silas was a shadow made flesh. He wore the high-collared black uniform of the Iron Fang elites, his face obscured by a wolf-head mask of obsidian. The sheer pressure of his presence was muffled, but through the bond I could feel his heart hammering, a war drum of anticipation. "Keep your head down and your scent neutral," Silas whispered, his voice vibrating against my ear. "The ball is a sea of perfumes and sweat. It will hide us for a while, but the moment you feel Corvick's gaze, we move toward the east wing. That's where Lyra is being held." We stepped into the grand ballroom, and the sensory assault was staggering. Hundreds of masked guests swirled in a dizzying dance under crystal chandeliers that dripped with magical light. The scent was a cloying mixture of wine, expensive oils, and the underlying metallic tang of hidden weapons. Silas took my hand, leading me into the dance. For a moment, we were just another couple in the crowd. As we moved, our bodies synchronized perfectly, the bond between us humming a low, steady rhythm. "You're staring," I murmured, looking into the violet slits of his mask. "I've never seen you in silk, Elara," he whispered, his hand tightening slightly on my waist. "You look like a goddess of the night. It's taking every ounce of my restraint not to roar and claim you right here in front of these traitors." "Focus, Alpha," I teased, though my own heart was racing. "We're here for Lyra. Save the roars for when we've reclaimed your throne." But as we spun toward the edge of the dance floor, the music suddenly hit a discordant note. At the far end of the hall, on a throne that sat too high and looked too heavy, a man stood up. He wasn't wearing a mask. His face was twisted into a smirk of pure, cold arrogance. Corvick. He raised a golden goblet, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predatory sharpness that made my skin crawl. "A toast," he roared, "to the end of the old world and the birth of the Iron Age." Chapter 27. Caught in the Act. The plan was to slip away during the toast, but the shadows in the east wing were not as empty as Silas's contact had promised. As we reached the heavy oak doors of the dungeon corridor, the air grew suddenly, unnervingly cold. "Silas, wait," I whispered, my Silvermoon mark beginning to throb with a warning heat. "Something is wrong. The light in this hallway. It's fake." It was too late. The torches on the walls flickered and died, replaced by a sickly green magical glow. From the darkness stepped 12 Iron Fang elites, their crossbows leveled at our chests. But they weren't the real threat. Corvic stepped out from behind them, clapping his hands in a slow, mocking rhythm. "Brother," Corvic said, his voice dripping with a feigned affection that made my stomach turn. "Did you really think I wouldn't know the scent of your obsession? You always did have a weakness for strays, Silas. But to bring the Silvermoon heir directly to my feet? That's almost too kind of you." Silas stepped in front of me, his body shifting into a defensive crouch, his alpha aura exploding outward with a force that cracked the stone floor beneath his boots. "Let her go, Corvic. Your quarrel is with me. You want the throne? Come and take it from the man you failed to kill." Corvic laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "I don't want to kill you yet, Silas. I want you to watch. I want you to see the moon go dark before I end your line forever." He snapped his fingers. Before Silas could move, a massive iron portcullis slammed down from the ceiling, crashing between us with the force of a falling mountain. I was trapped on one side with Corvic and his men. Silas was on the other. "Elara!" Silas roared, throwing himself against the iron bars. The metal was laced with silver. He couldn't touch it without his flesh burning, but he didn't care. He grabbed the bars, the sound of his skin sizzling filling the hallway as he tried to wrench them apart. "Go, Silas!" I screamed, pulling my dagger as Corvic's men closed in on me. "Get to the gates! The outcasts are waiting for the signal. Save Lyra!" "I'm not leaving you." Silas's eyes were pure, burning violet, his face contorting as he began a forced, partial shift to gain the strength to break the silver. Corvic stepped toward me, his hand catching my hair and pulling my head back. "He's right, you know. He's not leaving. He's going to stay right there and watch as I take you to the high tower. By the time the moon eclipses, there won't be enough of you left for him to bury." "I'll kill you!" Silas's voice was no longer human. It was the roar of the Shadow King, a sound of such pure, unadulterated rage that even Corvic's elites flinched. But the bars held. Corvic dragged me away toward the stairs, and the last thing I saw was Silas, his hands smoking and bloodied, reaching through the silver for a mate he couldn't touch. 1. Chapter 28. The Final Night. The high tower was a cage of wind and stone. Corvic had me chained to a central pillar of obsidian, the cold of the stones seeping into my bones. Outside, the sky was beginning to bruise. The blood moon eclipse was only hours away. "You're wasting your time, Corvic," I said, my voice raspy but steady. "The bond, it doesn't break. You can kill me, but Silas will find you. He'll tear this kingdom down stone by stone to get to your throat." Corvic walked to the edge of the tower, looking down at the city below where fires were already beginning to break out. The outcasts had arrived. I could hear the distant, faint howls of my people. "Let him try," Corvic said, turning back to me. He held a ritual dagger of pure, unrefined silver. "The prophecy says one must die for the other to rule. Silas thinks he's the one who will survive. He thinks he's the king. But he's just the distraction. Once you're dead, the Silvermoon power dissipates. The balance is broken. And I will be the only one left to pick up the pieces." Through the floorboards, I felt a vibration. It was faint at first, then stronger. A rhythmic, heavy thudding that shook the entire tower. Silas was coming. He wasn't using the stairs. He was climbing the exterior of the tower, his claws sinking into the stone, driven by a madness that only a fated mate can know. "He's here," I whispered, a dark, triumphant smile crossing my lips. Corvic's face hardened. He stepped toward me, raising the silver dagger. "Then he's just in time to watch the end." I reached out through the bond, sending every ounce of my love, my defiance, and my strength to the man clinging to the walls outside. "Silas, don't let the prophecy win. Don't let him take the light." A massive black shadow crested the ledge of the tower, a roar of pure berserker fury echoing off the clouds. Silas stood there, his clothes torn, his skin covered in stone dust and blood, his eyes glowing like violet sun. He didn't look like a man. He looked like death itself. Get away from her. The final night had begun. The moon turned a deep, bloody red, and the air on the tower grew thin and electric. One of us was going to fall. But as I looked into Silas's eyes, I knew it wouldn't be without a fight that would change the world forever. Chapter 29. The Siege Begins. The sky wasn't just dark, it was hemorrhaging. As the moon entered the Earth's shadow, turning the color of oxidized copper and stale blood, the signal was given. From the high tower, I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. The outcasts were no longer a rabble of broken wolves. They were a tide. The first wave hit the southern gates like a battering ram of fur and fury. They didn't have the heavy plate armor of the Iron Fang, but they had something far more dangerous. They had nothing left to lose. They fought with the desperation of the damned, led by the gray-muzzled elders I had trained in the dells. Inside the castle, the atmosphere was one of pure, unadulterated panic. I watched from my obsidian pillar as the elite guards, who had been laughing and drinking wine moments ago, scrambled to find their blades. The masquerade had become a massacre. The velvet banners were being torn down, and the crystal chandeliers shattered as the vibration of the siege shook the very foundations of the tower. But the real storm was much closer. Below the tower floor, I heard it, the sound of iron groaning and stone cracking. Silas had broken the silver-laced bars in the dungeon. I could feel the resonance of his berserker state through the bond. It wasn't the warm, golden hum I was used to. It was a white-hot, jagged scream of pure power. He was an alpha who had been separated from his mate, and the world was about to pay the price. "You hear that, Corvic?" I rasped, my voice sounding like gravel against the cold wind of the tower. "That's the sound of your kingdom rotting from the inside out. You thought you could take the shadow and leave the moon behind. You didn't realize that without the moon, the shadow has no shape." Corvic paced the edge of the tower, his silver dagger trembling in his hand. He looked down at the courtyard where his invincible Iron Fang were being overwhelmed by the very outcasts they had once spat upon. "Silence, rogue," Corvic spat, though his eyes were wide with a flickering terror. "The prophecy is absolute. One of you falls tonight. If the city burns, so be it. I will rule the ashes as long as the Vane and Silvermoon union is broken." "You're wrong," I whispered, my Silvermoon mark glowing with a sudden blinding intensity. The prophecy didn't account for one thing. It didn't account for the fact that we chose each other before the stars did. A massive, black-clawed hand gripped the edge of the tower balcony. The stone shattered under the pressure. Silas was here. Chapter 30. Shadow versus Iron. Silas didn't climb onto the tower. He exploded onto it. He was in a state of partial shift, his muscles swollen to twice their size, his hands ending in lethal obsidian claws, and his eyes, they weren't just violet anymore. They were voids of darkness rimmed with a terrifying supernatural fire. He didn't look like a king, he looked like the god of the abyss. "Step away from her," Silas said. His voice was no longer human. It was a multitonal vibration that made the very air on the tower ripple. Corvic lunged toward me, the silver dagger aimed at my throat. "One more step and she dies, Silas. The prophecy requires a sacrifice. Choose, your crown or your mate." Silas didn't even blink. He didn't hesitate. He moved with a speed that the human eye couldn't track. He didn't go for Corvic. He went for the chains holding me. With a single, savage swipe of his claws, the obsidian pillar was sheared in half. He caught me as I fell, his body a wall of heat and protective rage. "I choose her," Silas growled, his voice vibrating through my bones. "I'll burn the crown. I'll burn the palace. I'll burn the world to the ground before I let you touch her again." Corvic roared, his own shift taking over as he grew into a massive, gray-furred wolf. He was larger than Silas, fueled by a decade of jealousy and the dark magic he had stolen from the shadow vaults. The two alphas collided in the center of the tower, a whirlwind of teeth and claws. The impact was so great it cracked the floor of the high tower. I scrambled back, my Silvermoon power flaring as I tried to guide Silas's movements through the bond. I could see the flows of energy, the jagged, oily darkness of Corvic's betrayal versus the raw, unrefined power of Silas's love. "Silas, watch his left!" I screamed, my vision turning silver. Corvic lashed out with a silver-laced claw, catching Silas across the chest. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to feel the poison. He pinned Corvic against the battlement, his jaws closing around the traitor's throat. "This is for the spear," Silas muffled through the fur, "and this is for my queen." The tower groaned as the stone began to give way. The war wasn't just happening in the streets, it was happening right here, at the peak of the world, and only one of them was going to walk away. Chapter 31. The Beta's Betrayal. Corvic was desperate. As Silas's teeth sank deeper into his shoulder, the traitor shifted back to human form, reaching for a hidden mechanism in the stone floor. With a sickening clack, a trapdoor opened beneath them, not a drop to a room below, but a jagged opening to the 1,000-foot abyss outside the tower walls. They tumbled toward the edge, locked in a death grip. "If I don't rule, no one does," Corvic screamed, his face a mask of bloody madness. He grabbed the front of Silas's tunic, trying to drag him over the ledge. "The prophecy, Silas! Look at the moon! It's over!" I ran toward them, my fingers brushing the stone, but I was too late to stop the momentum. Silas looked back at me for one heartbreaking second. The berserker rage in his eyes vanished, replaced by a devastating, quiet tenderness. "I love you, little moon," he sent through the bond. It wasn't a thought. It was a soul print. "No!" I lunged, catching Silas's hand just as they slid over the edge. The weight was staggering. Silas was hanging over the abyss, holding onto Corvic's wrist with one hand and mine with the other. The silver-laced stones of the tower's edge were burning into Silas's palms, smoke rising from his skin. "Let go, Silas," Corvic hissed, dangling over the drop. "You can't save her and yourself. One must fall." "He's right, Elara," Silas gasped, his face pale, his strength finally flagging from the silver poison and the exhaustion of the siege. "The stone is breaking. If you don't let go, we both fall." "I am not letting go!" I screamed, the Silvermoon mark on my shoulder burning so hot it felt like a brand. "We are the balance, Silas. The shadow doesn't fall without the moon." Corvic pulled a small, silver stiletto from his boot and drove it into Silas's arm. Silas let out a choked gasp, his fingers slipping from the stone. "I'll see you in the dark, brother," Corvic smirked. They fell. I didn't think. I didn't pray. I didn't wait for the prophecy to take us. I threw myself off the tower after him. Chapter 32. The Sacrifice. The wind was a roar in my ears, a cold, violent force that tried to tear my spirit from my body. I saw Silas falling below me, his eyes wide as he saw me jump. Corvic was a tumbling shadow further down, disappearing into the mist of the valley. I reached out, my fingers straining against the air. Prophecy be damned, I thought. If he dies, there is nothing left to rule. In that moment of total surrender, something shifted. The "one must die" curse was based on the idea of power, of one bloodline taking precedence over the other. But as I reached for Silas, I wasn't reaching for a king. I was reaching for my soul. And he wasn't reaching for a queen, he was reaching for his life. We collided in midair, 500 feet above the jagged rocks. I wrapped my arms around his neck, and Silas pulled me against his chest, shielding my head with his massive arms. "I've got you," he whispered, though the wind should have swallowed the words. Suddenly, the golden light of the bond didn't just glow, it turned into a physical pillar of fire. The Silvermoon light from my blood and the shadow energy from his met and fused. It was the unified bloodline, a power that hadn't been seen in 1,000 years. We didn't hit the ground. A shockwave of pure, iridescent energy erupted from our point of contact, slowing our descent until we were floating in a sphere of gold and violet light. The blood moon above us didn't just eclipse, it seemed to shatter, the red light being replaced by a brilliant, blinding white. The prophecy had been a test. It was never about death. It was about the willingness to choose the other person over the power of the throne. By jumping, I had proven that my love was greater than my life. By shielding me, Silas had proven the same. We touched the ground in the center of the courtyard, the light fading slowly. The battle around us had stopped. Thousands of wolves, Ironfang and Outcast alike, stood in a circle, their heads bowed in a silence so profound it was deafening. I looked at Silas. His wounds were gone. His eyes were no longer violet or silver, they were a shimmering royal gold. He looked at me, and I saw the same light reflected in my own hands. "The prophecy is broken," I whispered. "No," Silas said, pulling me to my feet and kissing me in front of the entire kingdom. "The prophecy is finally fulfilled." Chapter 33. The Roar of Victory. The sun rose over a kingdom that was breathing for the first time in years. The Ironfang had surrendered the moment they saw the golden light. They knew their true king and queen had returned. Corvick was gone, lost to the abyss he had tried to weaponize. Silas and I stood on the steps of the great hall, looking out over the thousands of wolves gathered in the courtyard. There were no longer outcasts and elites. There were only the people of the north. "We have spent too long in the shadows," Silas's voice boomed, carrying to the furthest corners of the city. "We have fought amongst ourselves while the world watched us rot, but today, the shadow and the moon are one. There will be no more exiles, there will be no more purges." He turned to me, and to the shock of every wolf present, the Alpha King of the North knelt. He didn't just bow, he placed his forehead against the hem of my battle-torn dress. "I have led with a fist," he said, his voice dropping to a humble, powerful rumble. "But from this day forward, I lead with a heart. I am your king, but she is your soul. Long live the Silvermoon Queen." The sound was a physical thing, a wave of acceptance and joy that washed away the 3 years of my isolation. I reached down and pulled Silas up, my hand interlocking with his. "We have much to rebuild," I said to the crowd, my voice amplified by the Silvermoon magic. "But we will do it together. For the first time in our history, the night is not something to fear. It is our home." I looked at Silas, and the golden light in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. The rogue from the mountain and the fallen king had done the impossible. We had turned a death warrant into a destiny. Chapter 34. The Coronation. The coronation was not held in the stuffy throne room. It was held in the open air, at the highest point of the city, where the wind could carry the scent of our union to the borders. I wore a gown of liquid silver, the fabric shimmering like moonlight on water. Silas was in charcoal leather and gold, his presence no longer a heavy, suffocating weight, but a warm, steady anchor. Silas's sister, Lyra, whom we had rescued from the dungeons, stood between us. She held 2 crowns, one of obsidian for the shadow and one of white marble for the moon. "Do you, Silas Vane, swear to protect the light as fiercely as you command the dark?" Lyra asked, her voice clear and proud. "I so swear," Silas said, his eyes fixed on mine. "And do you, Elara Silvermoon, swear to guide the shadow as surely as you see the path?" "I so swear," I replied. As the crowns were placed on our heads, the bond flared one final time, a permanent seal of gold that would tie our lives together forever. We weren't just a pack, we were a legacy. The celebration lasted for 3 days. There was music, there was hunting, and for the first time, the stories told around the fires weren't about war. They were about the girl who saved a king, and the king who gave up his life for a rogue. But as the final night of the coronation drew to a close, Silas pulled me away from the festivities. He led me to the edge of the balcony, looking out toward the Blackwood peaks in the distance. "You miss it, don't you?" he asked softly, wrapping his arms around my waist. "The silence?" "Sometimes," I admitted, leaning back against his chest. But then I remember that the mountain was just a place I was waiting. This is where I'm living." "I have a surprise for you," he whispered, nipping at my ear. "A wedding gift." Chapter 35. The Eternal Bond. The surprise wasn't a jewel or a territory, it was a journey. Silas had taken me back to the Blackwood Peaks, but it wasn't the lonely mountain I remembered. My cabin had been rebuilt, but this time it was larger, made of white stone and dark cedar, perched on the edge of the Devil's Throat, with a view that spanned the entire kingdom. "Our summer den," Silas smirked, kicking open the door. Inside, the smell of pine and drying sage was waiting for me. It felt like home, but without the ghost of fear. We sat on the porch, watching the moon rise over the peaks. It was a full moon tonight, big, bright, and silver. "Are you ever going to tell me the truth, Elara?" Silas asked, pulling me into his lap. "What was the real reason you jumped off that tower? You knew the prophecy. You knew you could have stayed on the ledge and watched me fall, and you would have been the undisputed Queen of the North." I laughed, the sound echoing through the valley. "I jumped because I'm a rogue, Silas. We don't follow the rules, not even the stars' rules. And besides, I couldn't let you have all the fun of being a martyr." Silas's expression turned serious, his thumb tracing the gold ring on my finger. "I spent my life thinking that mine meant I owned you. I thought the bond was a way for me to have more power. I was such a fool." "And now?" I asked. "Now I know that mine means I am yours," he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. "The bond isn't a tether, Elara. It's a choice we make every single morning. You are the only person in this world who can tell me no, and you're the only person I want to hear it from." I leaned in, kissing him softly as the golden light of our shared soul bond hummed a peaceful, eternal melody. The shadow and the moon were no longer at war. They were the balance that held the world together. "I love you, my king," I whispered. "I love you, my queen," he replied. And as we looked out over our kingdom, the howl of 1,000 wolves rose from the valley below. Not a cry of war, but a song of a new era. The hunt was over, the runaway was home, and the bond was forever.